Every 4 years, the eyes of billions around the globe are focused on a rare group of individuals as they go faster, leap higher, and become stronger than ever before. The Olympic Games are not only the world's most spectacular and prestigious sporting occasion, they are also a monumental feat of organization, a commercial triumph, and an illustration of the ideals and vision of one man, Baron Pierre de Coubertin.
The Olympic Games are not just a world championship, but a quadrennial festival of universal youth, the springtime of mankind, the festival of supreme effort, multiple ambition, and all forms of youthful activity. They are celebrated by each succeeding generation as it arrives on the threshold of adulthood.
But the Olympic Games are only part of the life and work of Coubertin. Historian, writer, organizer, sportsman, and educationalist, Coubertin wrote 1,400 articles and books on a variety of subjects. Yet of the man himself, little is known.
I call him the most famous and known man in history, because when we hosted the Barcelona Games of 1992, if we had asked people in the street, who is Pierre de Coubertin? Or even if we'd asked members of sports federations, including members of the IOC, the answer would have been truly disappointing. Knowledge of this man goes from zero to minimum.
Pierre de Coubertin was born in Paris on New Year's Day, 1863. The fourth child of an aristocratic Catholic family, his father was a conservative and a royalist who could trace his nobility back to the 15th century. His mother was the daughter of the Marquis de Mireville. Her family home was Château de Mireville in Normandy. It was here that Coubertin spent his youth. But his childhood coincided with a traumatic era in French history. He grew up in the shadow of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The realities of war were brought home to the young Coubertin in a very personal way.
The Prussians reached Mireville, and in order to blow up the viaduct nearby, they needed a box to transport their gunpowder. So they took Pierre's croquet box. This devastated him.
The French army was defeated in less than a year. France ceded substantial territory to Prussia. Coubertin knew then that he wanted to play his part in restoring France to greatness, but hadn't yet understood how it could be achieved.
This is a kid, basically, in contemporary language, who has an identity crisis, who's looking for something to do in the world that makes a difference, that contributes to the national redevelopment, and at the same time is appropriate from a man of his education and training. He's a kind of lost kid early on.
The discipline of Coubertin's schooling in Paris left him very critical of the French education system. He thought its emphasis on religion and classical languages was at the expense of the natural and social sciences. Most importantly, Coubertin felt there was a total neglect of the values of physical education and sport.
Frankreich, damals gerade,
Coubertin realized that defeated France could only be resurrected through a new system of education, where the power of sport is used to instill young people with a new energy, both physically and mentally.
diese moralischen Kräfte dann geistig mitgab.
In 1884, Coubertin enrolled at the School of Political Science in Paris, a liberal college with modern teaching methods.
C'est un enseignement aussi très
Students enjoyed a great deal of familiarity with their professors.
intimité avec les professeurs avec lesquels on peut
Here, Pierre de Coubertin was radically changed.
Finalement, Coubertin a dû être bouleversé.
He saw his way forward through the courses he took in political science.
Il a connu à Sciences Po.
From that experience, Coubertin develops as he's looking for some kind of identity, some kind of project. So he attaches his bandwagon, so to say, to this general question of school reform. But then something very curious happens, like other marginalized, intellectually oriented young people at that time, and many, many intellectuals in France, they turn their eyes toward Britain, toward England.
Coubertin's affinity with British culture and education was rooted in his childhood. At the age of 12, he read the Thomas Hughes classic, Tom Brown's School Days. Set at Rugby, Hughes' novel described British public school life, with its particular emphasis on sport.
12 Jahre alt hat mit diesen
He imagined himself as a 12-year-old living through the trials of this tough schooling. He identified with the life portrayed.
Sport gebildet und dass sie
He saw that the benefit of this system of education was a spirit of community through sport.
Zufriedenheit erlangten.
In his book, Hughes, a former pupil at Rugby, had fictionalized the career of his own headmaster, Dr. Thomas Arnold. Coubertin thought that Arnold had perfected the balance between academic study and sport.
De Coubertin was very selective in what he chose to emphasize. What he overlooks is the bullying and the fagging and the harsher side of the English public school experience in the 19th century.
Coubertin came to believe that Britain's love of competition and teamwork, bred on the sports field, was the key to its political power and economic success.
With my eyes fixed on the funeral slab, inscribed simply with the name Thomas Arnold, I realized that here was the cornerstone of the British Empire.
This belief in Anglo-Saxon competitiveness was strengthened during Coubertin's visit to America's Ivy League universities in 1890.
When Coubertin has his experience after coming to the United States, where he saw mass sport developed, outside of school sport, university sport, but also extraordinarily popular sporting forms, crowds of hundreds of thousands. He had not seen this before. And he sees a sport which is still very much run by university authorities, has not yet been professionalized.
Coubertin wanted to instill the Anglo-American belief in the importance of sport into France.
Francia nunca comprendió Coubertin. France, being a reactionary country, never quite understands Pierre de Coubertin. And he comes up against countless problems. So in order to get sport recognized, he decides to internationalize it. And the only way to do this is to re-establish the Olympic Games.
Coubertin found an ally in Dominican priest Father Henri Didon. Didon had been educated at a college in Grenoble, which had a particular affinity with sport. It organized a sports day called the Rondeau Olympic Games. Didon became the head of the Arcueil College in Paris, where he used sport as a powerful educational tool. Coubertin and Didon developed a close friendship, and the sporting motto of Didon's school, Citius, Altius, Fortius, became Coubertin's Olympic motto. Faster, higher, stronger. Another important influence on Coubertin's thinking was Greek revivalism. Archaeological excavations throughout the 19th century had discovered countless treasures celebrating Hellenic civilization.
The reports from these excavations were printed almost daily in newspapers across the major European cities like Paris and Berlin. People were fascinated. These new discoveries were greeted with much enthusiasm.
Significantly, in 1875, German archaeologist Ernst Curtius began to uncover the ancient site of Olympia.
Germany had brought to light what remained of Olympia. Why should not France succeed in rebuilding its splendor? It was not far from there to the less dazzling but more practical and fruitful project of reviving the Games.
There were others who shared Coubertin's vision. In Greece, Evangelos Zappas had held small sporting festivals called the Zappian Olympic Games from 1859. Englishman Dr. William Penny Brooks had organized his Much Wenlock Olympian Games in Shropshire from 1850.
Coubertin goes there in 1890 as the honoured guest of Dr. Brooks and the local community. They make an enormous fuss over him, but I think it's not the major trigger for the campaign that Coubertin is running. I think it's because he's already formulated a broad view of a desire to recreate the Olympic Games in some form.
Celebrating the 23rd Olympiad of the modern era, I declare open the Olympic Games of Los Angeles.
Coubertin's vision was from the start one of internationalization. The others had small, local, regional competitions and hoped to impress with the phrase Olympic Games. To Coubertin, however, internationalization meant primarily cultural exchange and education for peace.
Und Friedenserziehung.
Coubertin first proposed the revival of the Olympic Games in 1892 at a conference at the Sorbonne in Paris. Few were willing to listen. 2 years later, he was back. This time, he was better prepared.
Coubertin had a genius for symbols. We do this in the Sorbonne, so we make it very clear to the authorities that this is educational sport, this is civilizing sport. And then with the appropriate toasts, with the demonstrative games, resurrecting ancient music, all of these abilities were helping to mobilize people to think that maybe this isn't such crazy stuff. And maybe this guy and his young pals can pull it off.
Coubertin's political skill became apparent.
He recruited people to come to this conference that he knew were favorable to his idea, So he basically had a stacked deck, but he stacked it, and pretty smart way he did it. Well, very astute politically.
The 1894 conference selected the first International Olympic Committee, with Demetrios Vikalis of Greece as its first president. Coubertin was its general secretary. It was agreed that the Games should be held in Greece. But the impoverished Greek government opposed the plan. Coubertin refused to accept defeat and lobbied for more support. A group of wealthy Greek businessmen rallied to the cause. With the support of the royal family, they forced the Greek government into agreeing to the venture. On the 25th of March, 1896, the first modern Olympic Games began. Coubertin was sidelined by the Greek organizers, creating a feud that was to last over 30 years.
What Coubertin failed to understand is that the Olympic project really is indistinguishable from the whole issue of Greek national sovereignty. So partly the reason that he gets set aside is that he's very good for publicity purpose. He's got to supply the internationals, which the Greeks can't. He has tremendous organizing ability. But this is at the center of Greek national consciousness and political destiny. You don't entrust such things to young, naive, energetic, well-intentioned foreigners.
Although the Greeks enjoyed little success at the Games, their patriotic fervor was aroused by Spiridon Lewis in the marathon.
I suspect that the victory in the marathon is probably the most exciting, emotional event in the history of sports. And I just can't even imagine the frenzy in the crowd when Lewis came into the stadium. The Crown Prince actually ran down onto the stadium track and ran alongside him.
But Lewis's victory created more problems for Coubertin. The Greeks, inspired by success, decided that they would like to keep the Games in Greece permanently. The Sorbonne Conference of 1894 had stipulated that the Games would be hosted by a new city every 4 years, with Paris in 1900 the next venue. Coubertin wanted to safeguard this undertaking. He suggested to the Greeks that they stage a quadrennial Pan-Hellenic Games in Athens in the intervals between the regular Olympic celebrations. With that, peace was restored. Coubertin broke with tradition when he married a Protestant, Marie Roton, in 1895.
At that time, it was inconceivable for a Catholic to marry a Protestant, but the family accepted it. It was proof of their independence in face of the taboos of the day, which were extraordinary.
They had 2 children, a daughter, Renée, and a son, Jacques, who at the age of 2 suffered sunstroke. He never recovered.
His nanny didn't put his hat on for him. He became handicapped as a consequence. This was a tragedy for Pierre because he was very proud of his son. He was a sweet boy.
Coubertin, now president of the IOC, had an ambitious vision for the 1900 Games in Paris, where there was to be a world exposition, attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors from around the world. Coubertin dreamed of reconstructing the ancient site of Olympia at the exposition. He set up an organizing committee for the Games, but the more powerful World Exposition Committee took over the running of the Games, pushing Coubertin aside.
One historian has written that the 1900 Olympics should be called the farcical Olympics because they were the strangest games we've had. They had live pigeon shooting and swimming. They had an obstacle race. The swimming was done in the River Seine. They had to swim under boats and then climb over a row of boats to, then finish the 200-meter obstacle course. The famous story concerns in the 60s, the French Olympic Committee tried to round up all their former medal winners. They found one, Fernand Vassereau, a cyclist who had won a medal in 1900 in the match sprint cycling. He had no idea he had been in the Olympic Games.
Amidst the chaos and controversy, the Games did produce one notable success. They were the first to be captured on film by early experiments in cinematography. Some of the athletes were chosen as subjects for the study of human movement by experimental photographer Jules Marais. The 1904 Games were due to take place in St. Louis, USA. There was controversy surrounding the selection of the host city. Coubertin favored the more well-known city of Chicago. But he found himself in opposition to James E. Sullivan, the president of the American Athletic Union, the most powerful sports administrator in America.
He hated Coubertin. He feuded with Coubertin openly. He wanted to be on the International Olympic Committee. Coubertin never let him on. He then wanted to try and start his own International Olympic Committee and take it over from de Coubertin, and that never materialized.
St. Louis was planning a large world fair and secured the American Athletic Union Championships to run alongside. Sullivan wanted the Olympic Games to be part of the event. After much deliberation, Coubertin agreed to transfer the Games to St. Louis under the direction of James Sullivan. The Olympic track and field events took place on the campus of Washington University. Coubertin chose not to travel to the Games and avoided what proved to be a mess, just as shambolic as Paris had been 4 years earlier. The events took place over a period of almost 5 months. Many events were not truly Olympic, but merely local championships at the fair. As with the Paris Games in 1900, today's historians are still trying to ratify events and winners.
Sullivan said, I'm going to organize the biggest, baddest set of Olympic Games you've ever seen. He held hundreds of events, and he called everything Olympics. There was Western athletic handicap contests, Irish football. There were many sort of local contests where only people from certain regions of the United States can compete. And Sullivan put the term Olympic on all of these.
The Olympic dream needed help. It came from the Greeks, who were desperate to stage the Games again. Coubertin was reluctant to hold another Games after only 2 years, but realizing his Olympic vision was fading, agreed to stage an event in Athens in 1906. But he denied them the status of official Olympic Games, and they became known as the Intermediate Games. Ironically, they turned out to be the savior of Coubertin's Olympic dream.
What they did was show definitively, once and for all, that you didn't need a World's Fair in order to hold an Olympic Games that would attract attention, energy, international delegations, and so on. It was sort of as if the Greek organizers were managing to say, once again, Coubertin, the International Olympic Committee, do you finally get it?
Coubertin didn't attend the event. He remained in Paris and called a conference to discuss the inclusion of a fine arts competition into the Olympic program. Coubertin's love affair with art began in his youth. His father was a painter of some repute. Coubertin loved sketching and often rode the 25 kilometers from Merville to Étretat, a popular artist's retreat.
All the Parisian intelligentsia would converge on the beaches of Étretat. Since the Coubertin family was very artistic, it was only natural that they took part in all this.
It was Coubertin's great ambition to revive the unity of sport and art as understood by the Greeks. The idea was not well received.
Die Leute glaubten, der ist nicht ganz dicht.
He was derided as a lunatic. People asked themselves, how could you evaluate the performance of an artist with gold medals? So he encountered a lot of opposition to his suggestion. A lot of good artists refused to take part.
Coubertin would have to wait until 1912 to implement his fine arts plan. At the 1908 London Games, Coubertin once again met his adversary, James Sullivan.
The Americans and the British were arguing throughout the whole games, and a lot of it was protests in many of the sporting events, especially track and field athletics, but there were others. There were cycling and wrestling protests and things like that. And a lot of this had to do, again, with James Sullivan, who was in charge of the U.S. team, and he just protested everything. Whenever anything went against an American athlete, he protested, and he made a big deal out of it.
The biggest controversy involved Italian runner Dorando Pietri in the marathon.
Pietri came into the stadium, and a very small gentleman, and had a big lead over an American, Johnny Hayes, and he collapsed when he got into the stadium from the effort. And the British officials and a lot of the spectators and people down on the track had really taken this small little guy to their heart. They went over and helped him. They got him up, they sort of pointed him in the right direction. He ran a few more steps, he collapsed again.
Pietri crossed the line as the American John Hayes entered the stadium. The Americans protested about the help given to Pietri. Hayes was declared the winner. Despite the bickering, the 1908 Games were a major public success. At a service at St. Paul's Cathedral on the opening day, Coubertin heard the sermon of an American bishop, Ethelbert Talbot. Coubertin later adapted a phrase from the sermon which would become his epitaph. The important thing in life is not victory, but struggle. The essential thing is not to conquer, but to fight well. The London Games had reinvigorated Coubertin's Olympic movement. In Stockholm in 1912, it had its finest hour. New stadia were built, and the enthusiastic Swedes were blessed with 2 weeks of good weather. Coubertin was there in person to see at last the inclusion of his fine arts program, the pentathlon of the Muses.
The Swedish Academy of Arts had objections. They maintained that the concept was not well thought out and the artistic values were not high enough. When Coubertin protested against the criticism, his friend, the Swedish IOC member Victor Balk, suggested that Coubertin should hold the event in Paris instead and send the prize-winning artworks to Stockholm.
In the competition, Coubertin won an Olympic gold medal for literature with his Ode to Sport under the German pseudonyms Horod and Eschbach.
O sport, you are peace. You promote happy relations between peoples, bringing them together in their shared devotion to a strength which is controlled, organized, and self-disciplined.
There were only 3 entries, so it would have won a medal in any case. In the end, they only gave out 2 medals. Apparently, nobody knew that Coubertin was the author of the winning entry. Personally, I'm skeptical on this.
The biggest controversy at the Games came after the King of Sweden awarded the great American athlete Jim Thorpe his gold medals for the pentathlon and the decathlon. At the Sorbonne Conference in 1894, the IOC had made a specific recommendation that Olympic participants should be gentlemen amateurs, not professionals. Thorpe was later disqualified when it was discovered he had played baseball for money.
Coubertin sensed the evolution that was taking place. He clearly stated that what was important was loyalty, and that he was by no means a supporter of the strict and stupid rules which led to the retrospective disqualification of Jim Thorpe.
À la mise hors jeu rétroactive de Jim Thorpe.
It would be 70 years before Thorpe's medals were reinstated, and long after his death. No sooner had the enthusiasm of Stockholm subsided than the storm clouds of war began to gather over Europe. Once again, there would be German troops on French soil. Coubertin, confident in the pacifying influence of Olympism, insisted that the 6th Olympic Games, awarded to Berlin in 1911, should go ahead.
The IOC and the National Olympic Committees were at the time not powerful enough. They had no authority to influence the outcome of negotiations between individual states in cases of war. In 1914, the First World War broke out, 8 days after the Olympic Congress in Paris, and the 1916 Games were cancelled.
Coubertin was determined not to see his creation dismantled. In 1915, he moved the IOC headquarters to Lausanne, in neutral Switzerland. His family followed 4 years later, a decision hastened by the fragile health of his children. His move didn't stop him rushing to the defense of his country. At the age of 51, Coubertin wanted to fight for France. He was eventually given a role as an interpreter, but despite repeated requests, he was not sent to the front. The end of the war brought more problems for Coubertin.
His father's death had left him with a considerable inheritance. He invested a great deal of the money into his movement. I believe his wife was not too happy about that. What he had left, he invested in stocks, and after the First World War, with the general inflation, the value of the funds had evaporated.
Once again, Coubertin believed that the Games could help the world recover after the Great War. Where better to hold the Games of the 7th Olympiad than Antwerp in Belgium, a city devastated by the fighting. When the Antwerp Games opened, Coubertin was there to witness his latest innovation, the 5 rings of the new Olympic flag.
It's not that each circle represents a continent. For example, black representing Africa. No, the colors are the entire range to be found in all the world's flags. Pierre de Coubertin created a flag hoping for it to become the flag of humanity.
Once more, the Games were a success. Coubertin's position was now being threatened by the emergence of the powerful international sports federations and by the younger members of the IOC.
In 1921, the international sports federations were calling for a reorganization of the IOC. Coubertin was no longer in a position to provide funds. As a result, the members of the IOC formed an executive board whose chairman was not the president himself.
By 1921, time and history were moving against Coubertin. He had decided to retire in 1925, but first he wanted the opportunity to rectify one of his major disappointments, the debacle of the 1900 Games in Paris. His wish was granted. The 1924 Games in Paris were a worthy and fitting tribute to their founder. The IOC also sanctioned an Olympic Winter Sports Week at Chamonix, France. This 11-day event became the first Olympic Winter Games. Coubertin was made the first honorary president of the IOC, but his retirement would not be a contented one. At the Prague Congress in 1925, the participation of women at the Olympic Games was discussed once again. Throughout his life, Coubertin was steadfastly opposed to women's inclusion in athletic events.
C'était, selon les conceptions de l'époque, par...
This attitude was dictated by so-called respect for women. It wasn't thought conceivable for a woman to be seen grimacing and sweating in a stadium, exposed to the intense gaze of a male public in the stands.
Dans les tribunes.
A woman's role was therefore to be limited to giving out medals and flowers.
Les médailles, les bouquets.
Women had first taken part in the Games in 1900, but not in track and field. The IOC now wanted to move with the times. Coubertin was isolated.
Eine völlig verrückte Vorstellung.
It was a totally eccentric position considering the social transformations of the 1920s and the international movement of women's emancipation. So the leading heads of sports did not go along with him on that issue.
Illness prevented Coubertin from attending the Amsterdam Games in 1928, where female athletes competed in track and field for the first time. But when a number of women found themselves in distress at the end of the 800 meters, Coubertin felt vindicated.
The Amsterdam experience seems to have legitimized my opposition to the admission of women to the Olympic Games. The accounts I have received from a great majority of witnesses to the event are thus far hostile to the renewing of the spectacle provided by women's events.
In 1927, the Greeks erected a column in Olympia honoring the renaissance of the Olympic Games. They engraved it with Coubertin's name, and thus ended their feud with him that had begun in 1896.
Reconciliation with Greece was of the utmost importance to him. His educational activities from 1924 had made him friends in Greece. And in his last will, he declared that he wanted his heart to be buried in this very column.
Coubertin was by now estranged from his wife and living in hotels in Lausanne. His family money had gone, and Chateau de Mireville had to be sold in 1930. It was a cruel blow.
The impoverished circumstances to which my life has been unceasingly and increasingly subject over the past 8 years have reduced my resources and increased my expenditure in such a way that this life will end in anguish with regard to my family and the fate which threatens them.
It took the family 30 years to repurchase Mireville. In 1932, the Games were celebrated at Los Angeles, even though the Great Depression that was ravaging the world was at its height. Ironically, it was the first Olympic Games to make a profit. In desperate times, people flocked to a sporting festival. Not until the Games returned to Los Angeles in 1984 would an Olympic Games make money. Coubertin's personal finances meant that he had to be provided with lodgings by the Lausanne Municipal Council at Villa Montrepos, which became the headquarters of the IOC. In In 1936, Coubertin's tireless work on behalf of humanity was acknowledged when he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He didn't win. Berlin had been awarded the 1936 Games in 1931. 2 years later, Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime was in power in Germany. Coubertin's friend, Karl Dieb, organized the Games. But the Berlin Games and Coubertin's association with them will always be surrounded by controversy.
The National Socialist government provided the funds, and Diem took the opportunity to organize the Games according to the wishes and desires that Coubertin had expressed over decades of their collaboration. This mutual sharing of ideas led to Coubertin being associated with the Nazi regime. As an observer from a distance, he was content that these games were organized according to his own vision. What he did not realize was that he himself was misappropriated as a symbolic figure for the games.
Coubertin would not see another Olympic Games. On the 2nd of September 1937, whilst walking through Parc de la Grange on the bank of Lake Geneva, Coubertin collapsed and died of a heart attack. At the time, he was living alone in poverty. He was 74.
I think Coubertin, like so many of the great men of humanity, died forgotten. He was a man who spent his whole fortune in getting the Olympic movement off the ground. So this man, who deserves recognition from the whole of humanity, received not one bit of it from anyone.
As requested, his heart was taken to Olympia, the spiritual home of the Games. His body was laid to rest in Lausanne, Switzerland, the city and country that offered him shelter in his hour of need. His wife, son, and daughter were later buried with him. Despite his many achievements, Coubertin died believing that his great dream was unfulfilled.
Olympism represents only a part of my enterprise, perhaps half of it. My educational symphony is composed of a finished part and of another, which is unfinished.
He'd always seen the Olympic Games as significant only in the sense that it contributed to educational reform. The irony of his life is that what was to be the means, in a certain sense, became the end.
But in Olympism, Coubertin did leave a great legacy. A belief in the need to strive for human perfection, a commitment to fair play in competition, and the hope that through sport, we can achieve tolerance, peace, and harmony throughout the world.
I think he'd be proud of what his successors have done, of his tremendous legacy. He'd be surprised, probably, by the changes. I'd be surprised by many things. But the very fundamental values and ideas that he's defended and promoted around the world are still there.
Pierre de Coubertin, the founder of the modern Olympic Games.